This is the U.S. Report with James Morrow.
Good evening and welcome to the program. Tons of stuff to cover with you and a ton of great guests to talk to, so let's get straight into it. Coming up tonight, Anthony Albanese wraps up his trip to Washington. Nuclear submarines, the Middle East crisis, and China, all part of high-level talks with the U.S. president. I'll break that down with the Australian's Washington correspondent, Adam Creighton, in a moment. Also tonight, terror on the border. Exclusive details on Palestinian jihadists caught coming in through Mexico. Investigative reporter Jenny Taylor reveals the threat. Plus, the chaos in Congress is over. But who is the new Speaker of the House? And is he on a mission from God? Mick Mulvaney will have the latest on that shortly. Right, let's get into it. Well, the world may be going to hell in a handcart, and we're going to cover all the serious stuff in a little bit. But amidst all the chaos, I guess on some level, it is heartening to know that there is one thing we can still count on. That is this: if you put Joe Biden in front of cameras at an important event, well, it's not going to be great. This week, of course, saw Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese touch down in Washington. Talk about timing. For high-level talks with Team Biden, as well as a somewhat subdued state dinner that saw Joe Biden not even manage to put on a proper bow tie. And the Australian PM? Well, he looked like he just picked something up off the wedding season rack at Politics. Part of the visit, of course, involved the traditional bilateral press conference, which went, well as can be expected.
I want to thank the Israelis and the and President Sisi of Egypt.
Palestinians, President Sisi of Egypt, what's the difference? Then the president went on to say something that was actually, hold on to your hats, sensible.
I'm convinced one of the reasons Hamas attacked when they did, I have no proof of this, just my instinct tells me, is because of the progress we were making towards regional integration for Israel and regional integration overall.
Yes, got it in one, Mr. President, even if it was, shall we say, rather inelegantly expressed. Because it's true. Israel's increasingly close ties with the Arab world, including even Saudi Arabia, a process that was started under the Abraham Accords, started by your predecessor, Sir one Donald J. Trump, not that you'd acknowledge it, surely helped provoke Iran, which also is in competition with the Arab world to use Hamas to attack Israel. Good stuff, Mr. President. And yet then you had to go and ruin it.
And we can't leave that work behind. And one more word on this. I continue to be alarmed about extremist settlers attacking Palestinians in the West Bank.
So let's get this straight. Hamas has just butchered 1,400 people and taken 200 more hostages, human shields, and this is what the president's worried about. Honestly, I mean, sure, obviously Israeli civilians shouldn't launch freelance attacks on innocent Palestinians. But is this the sort of issue that deserves to be elevated to the president's remarks? Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran and all of America's enemies must be laughing all the way as Biden tut-tuts his supposed allies. But when it comes to the Palestinians, well, he's very keen to make sure we all know that they are a totally peace-loving bunch of folk.
We also have to remember that Hamas does not represent, let me say it again, Hamas does not represent the vast majority of the Palestinian people on the Gaza Strip or anywhere else.
Now, I checked, and the White House didn't provide a footnote with a source for that data, but maybe it's out there somewhere. You tell me. Then, of course, there were the usual stumbles, losing his way in the order of proceedings.
Oh, I get that. I get that. Okay. PBS.
Getting testy with reporters.
But aren't these hostages in jeopardy if there is a ground invasion?
You want to make a speech?
Making a weird, debunked claim about going on a road trip with Xi Jinping.
The fact is that I have met with Xi Jinping more than any other world leader has. I've had over 68 hours of private meetings, just he and I, with simultaneous interpreters, starting back when I was vice president, because it wasn't appropriate for a president of the United States to be meeting with the vice president. So I traveled 17,000 miles with him.
Yeah, Xi Jinping, he's the new corn pop, haven't you heard? And of course, anyway, it wouldn't be a Biden stand-up without an anyway.
We have had troops in the region since 9/11 to go after ISIS and prevent its reemergence in both, anyway, in the region.
Anyway, to be fair to the president, he did have some moments of clarity during this press conference. He said that Israel absolutely had a right to defend itself, which is great. And, hallelujah, he cast doubt on the death toll figures out of Gaza, saying, quote, "I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed." So credit where credit is due. Biden is right, and no one should take figures from the laughably named Hamas Health Ministry as anything more than lies and propaganda. Yet, as I have said before, and I will continue to say on this program, it is completely hypocritical for the Biden administration to talk tough and say Israel can defend itself while also trying to play Israel off a break by trying to determine the extent to which it can fight back against Hamas and its lunatic Ayatollah paymasters in Tehran. The same guys, by the way, who first Obama and now Biden are still going to allow to get a nuclear bomb one of these days. To give you a taste of just how the Biden administration is trying to manage this situation, let me reveal this amazing detail about what happened when Secretary of State Anthony Blinken went to Israel after the Hamas attacks, but before Joe Biden showed up. Blinken was very concerned about humanitarian aid getting into Gaza, and that Israel not strike back as hard as it would like. According to this report in the Israeli press, quote, "According to reports, the expanded cabinet discussed the exact wording of the decision for hours, while each time drafts were passed between the cabinet room and Blinken's room just a few meters away at the Kiryat in Tel Aviv." The report goes on to say that eventually, at approximately 3 a.m., they achieved an agreement on the text that was read in English in the cabinet room, unquote. Meanwhile, also note that Blinken is, according to multiple reports, a childhood friend of Robert Malley, the Biden administration's special envoy to Iran, who had his security clearance revoked recently and went missing after he was caught up in an Iranian influence buying and information purchasing operation, and who may, and I stress may, have been how a leaked classified administration memo about responding to pro-democracy protests in Iran made its way into the hands of the Tehran Times. So you see, this is where we are, folks, and this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how confused the Biden administration and the West are. The U.S. and much of the West is playing what I think is a dangerous double game, with Joe Biden, of all people, as its figurehead, when what is needed now is moral clarity and a real stance against evil. Time to bring in my first guest. Joining me now is the Australian's Washington correspondent, Adam Creighton. Adam, thanks so much for joining us here. Huge week. Let's start with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's state visit in Washington. Tell us about the visit. All went smoothly?
Yes, look, it was a fantastic visit, I think. I mean, it was a big success. It was certainly long. It was 4 full days. I think the Prime Minister actually left just a few hours ago. His last formal function was at the State Department, in this gorgeous Benjamin Franklin dining hall, where he was welcomed by Kamala Harris, the Vice President, and also the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. He spoke very well. Look, I mean, he spoke well throughout the whole trip. So I think it's a big success for him. I mean, whether that plays domestically well back home, I suppose remains to be seen. But, I mean, he couldn't have asked for a better trip. And indeed, the weather here, everyone was talking about it all week. It really was very sublime.
Well, that's great, but then there were some other interesting bits about the diplomacy here, especially around China. And Joe Biden cautioned Australia against fully trusting China. Now, do you think that had to do anything with the Albanese government's moves to normalize, smooth out relations, and some of the disputes about whether or not that Port of Darwin lease would be allowed to continue.
Yeah, certainly there was no mention, publicly at least, of the Port of Darwin situation, but certainly some in the American administration would be concerned about this move to normalisation. But I think there's an understanding as well that for Australia, China is a very, very important economic partner. And so we have to kind of straddle these two worlds, both, kind of being an ally of the United States, but also we have to maintain our economic relationship. It's very difficult. I think the Albanese government so far is treading a reasonable path. I mean, I don't know about the Port of Darwin thing. I, maybe wouldn't have approved that, but more or less, China seems to be taking off its tariffs and so forth, which is a good thing economically. But of course, we have to be careful, and that's what President Biden said, that we have to trust but verify. They were his words.
And now, those were Reagan's words, too, about the Soviet Union, quite famously. But talk us also through some of the congressional jitters that have been vibrating out of Washington around the AUKUS deal. Is there an actual threat to AUKUS? Could Republicans take it down because they're concerned, about the ability of the U.S. to build its own submarines?
Well, it's really interesting, this situation, because if you talk to administration officials and very senior ones, such as Kurt Campbell, who I spoke to just a few hours ago, actually, at the function that I just mentioned, he's extremely confident that all the relevant legislation will be passed this year. And that's the same message that you'll get from Carolyn Kennedy and from other senior figures. So the administration is very confident. But if you talk to analysts on the ground in Washington, they say that when push comes to shove, the US is going to be unwilling in a few years' time to part with what would be about 10% of its submarine fleet, because so much of the US submarine fleet is currently in for maintenance and so forth, and it's well behind production schedule. I think they're building something like 1.2 submarines a year when they really need to be building at least 2. So there's a huge number of bottlenecks here. So there's a real contrast. And look, I can't predict the future, but certainly the Prime Minister is confident too, as you suggested. He met all of those congressional leaders just this morning and also yesterday, and they said all the right things. So look, it remains to be seen over the next few months, I should say.
I got to say, Adam, just having read history, the 1930s and the fights to get everybody's navies into shape really sort of ring very resonant here. But I want to move on to the Middle East, where we had the questions, around Israel. We saw Joe Biden this week, I thought, being very strong on Israel and its right to defend itself. Was there any discussion between Albanese and Biden on this? And does that put Albanese in a funny position, given the problems he's been having in Australia with his Labour caucus on Israel?
Well, look, I think the two leaders share the same problem, that there's a small element in both of their left-wing parties that are very pro-Palestinian, and they do exert some force. Indeed, you saw the president just a few days ago at his joint press conference. I think for the first time he was mildly critical of Israel, well, at least of the settlers anyway. He said that it was pouring gasoline on the fire, so to speak, to be expanding further into the West Bank, and that's the first time that he said something like that. He also reiterated the US's support for a two-state solution. So I thought that was kind of a move away, a small step back, if you like, from his stronger address a week ago. Look, I'm sure they talked about it. I mean, Australia, as you know, is a very strong supporter of kind of whatever the US does globally, and certainly we're providing humanitarian aid, just as we are with Ukraine. So I don't think the US is upset with our position.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And finally, I want to ask about this horrible shooting in Maine. And there's a whole lot of questions being raised about it. I mean, we have at least 18 dead at this stage, maybe more. The shooter, the alleged shooter, apparently was an Army reservist who told Army doctors and was briefly hospitalized about saying that he'd heard voices basically telling him to shoot up the Army base. At the same time, you've got Kamala Harris now using this to say, well, the U.S. should have an Australian-style gun ban, and she spoke quite forcefully, saying that the U.S. should go down that road, which I'm not sure how they would ever practically do that. How are the politics playing out on this, and is this going to be more than just, another one of these mass shootings that comes up, happens, and then people move on to the next thing?
Well, look, certainly, these shootings are all too frequent, and it's a great tragedy. It's a shocking atrocity, and to some extent it overshadowed the last part of the Prime Minister's trip. But yes, every time something like this happens, it's almost immediately politicized, whether it's the race of the shooter or the policies of the state. And so straight away here, you've seen a lot of people blaming the Republican Senator Susan Collins from the state of Maine, because apparently a few years ago she didn't support tougher rules around gun purchase. But look, I think it's very unseemly to do this, even though it happens all the time, trying to draw a bow between a particular rule and then some psycho out there in the community who's just done this shocking thing. So look, I mean, it's not going to change US policy. As you alluded, there's going to be no change, no substantive change. The reality of the United States is that there's hundreds of millions of guns floating around, and the horse is well and truly bolted, I think, for gun control. I mean, you can try at the edges, but sadly the US has got itself in this position where you have a massive country, a massive population. What is it, 340 million, and even a small percentage of psychos are going to, will obviously cause a lot of damage periodically. It's a shocking tragedy.
Absolutely right. Very sad. Adam Creighton, thank you so much for joining us from Washington.
Thanks, James.
Let's bring you my next guest. Joining me now is political journalist John Fund. John, great to have you with us on the program here. Massive news out of the Middle East still going on. Israel has not fully gone into Gaza yet, although that is expected to happen one of these days very soon, perhaps within hours. How is this all playing out politically, John, for the president? Joe Biden has been quite strong in some of his defenses about Israel. Is this going to play well for him domestically and perhaps give him a bit of that impression of being a leader when he has for the past many months seemed very much to be kind of doddering and blown around by the winds?
Americans do not focus on foreign policy unless their own citizens are in peril, and so far we're only talking about 10 hostages. But Joe Biden is not helped that much by this in the end, because the more there is crisis and chaos in the world, the more people look at an 81-year-old, 82-year-old, whatever he is, and say, is this the man that we want to make the consequential decisions, and is he prepared for it? So I think that Biden probably view this as a net negative. The world in chaos is not his friend. Having said that, I think that Biden's strong Israel stance certainly helps him in the Jewish community, but there are suspicions among many members of Congress that he went so foursquare for Israel because he wanted to have leverage to prevent them from exercising a Gaza invasion quickly. In other words, the U.S. now has a veto power, in effect, over much of Israelis' foreign policy. And that is a problem, because the Israelis said 10 days ago they would be invading. I'm still waiting. You're still waiting. Many people will make a little bit more, I think.
And John, every day that doesn't happen, every day of waiting, Hamas gets to dig in that much harder, prepare itself for whatever Israeli invasion or attempt to unroot them is going to look like. And at the same time, we're also on that theme of chaos. We're now seeing attacks by Iranian-backed militants in Iraq against U.S. forces and a general turning up of the temperature. Is the actual analogy here, Joe Biden talked about China this week, saying trust but verify, using Reagan's words. But is Joe Biden actually turning into the next incarnation of Jimmy Carter?
Well, I'll tell you, Biden's policy on Iran was not trust but verify. It was mostly trust and ship money to them when he was the vice president under Obama. And of course, $6 billion in oil credits that haven't yet been transferred but were agreed to. I think that the real problem here is that the United States is once again negotiating with itself. It's negotiating with its better self. It's negotiating as if it were negotiating with another democracy and someone whose word could be kept. That is not the case. The real problem here is fortitude. The Israelis have it. I'm not sure the U.S. has it. Any invasion of Gaza is going to be a bloodbath. Now, that's not a negative word. That's simply a descriptive word. There will be a lot of casualties, including many civilians who have been told by Hamas to stay in place. Can the Western world take all of the fury that will result from that from the usual quarters? And that will include, of course, Europe.
And so that then, leads to the next question, which is how much of that Iranian dealing that he's been doing, not just, I would say, trusting, or you said trusting, but also, in fact, actively enabling them under Obama, the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. We still haven't really seen much even in the way of sanctions reimposed on Iran. This seems very much, I think, like Joe Biden is playing a double game here, talking like Israel is their friends, but limiting what they can do. And at the same time, saying to Iran, well, we want you to still be a major player in the Middle East, even if you're attacking our troops. How does that work?
You're giving them too much credit, James. I think they're just making it up as they go along. Remember, Biden was part of the administration led by Barack Obama, who said that his leadership style in the world was leading from behind. Well, I think we're leading from some part of our body that has nothing to do with our brain. Let's put it that way. And I think it's the gastrointestinal tract that is constantly churning with, am I going to be criticized? Am I going to be criticized? So I don't think there's much coherence here. Now, luckily, the Israelis have decided, and some of the Arab world has decided, that it's good to go along with this for a while because there's no other plausible alternative. But I think we're going to come to a break point very soon in which hard decisions are going to be made. What will the response to these massacres be? And I fear the world's resolve to punish Hamas is dwindling by the moment.
John Fund, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure having you here on the U.S. Report. Now, tons more coming up in the show, including more details on Mike Johnson. Who's that? Well, he's the new Speaker of the House. And Mick Mulvaney will give us the inside story. Plus, a bit later on in the show, I'll be joined by Israeli activist and actress Noah Tishby to talk about how the left is getting it all wrong on Israel. How wrong? Just take a look at this. When a reporter asked Karine Jean-Pierre about the rise in anti-Semitism, this is what she had to say.
What is his level of concern right now about the potential rise of anti-Semitism in light of everything that's going on in Israel?
So a couple of things. We have not seen any credible threats. I know there's been always questions about credible threats, and so just want to make sure that that's out there. But look, Muslim and those perceived to be Muslim have endured a disproportionate number of hate-fueled attacks.
Wait a second. Did she just turn a question about anti-Jew hatred into a thing about Islamophobia? Yes, she did. All that and more a little later in the program. Don't go away. Welcome back to the program. You're watching the U.S. Report. Big news out of Washington, where Congress has finally got itself a Speaker of the House. That's right, just 3 weeks after the bizarre coup by Matt Gaetz and a handful of Republicans against Kevin McCarthy, conservative Louisiana Congressman and Trump ally Mike Johnson won the gavel with 220 votes, ending 23 days of leaderlessness. So, who is Mike Johnson? Well, he's making all the right enemies as far as I'm concerned. He's no moderate, and he's a serious Christian as well. He's kept a pretty low profile, which I think will be to his advantage ultimately, because there are fewer preconceived notions about him. Legislators across the spectrum of the party will be inclined to give him a long honeymoon as they project their own hopes onto this seemingly blank canvas. And as I said before, all the right people hate him. The New York Times, for example, has harumphed about how the far right has gotten its man in the speaker's chair. Well, fine, and that's to be expected because, you know what? They won't be happy about any Republican speaker at the New York Times. But I think instead of listening to the Times, let's hear from the man in his own words. Here's new House Speaker Mike Johnson, back before he was Speaker, going to bat for free speech against the FBI and the big tech giants.
You've documented carefully in the Twitter files are a couple of key facts. People will hear a lot of things today, but this is what they need to know. The federal government, from Democrat members of Congress to intelligence agencies, including the FBI, used Twitter and other social media companies to censor Americans' speech. If the alarm bells are not going off, then you're not paying attention. Over the past 3 years, documents show, they prove what you guys have uncovered here. There's communication between Twitter and the FBI. It was constant, it was pervasive. Twitter was basically an FBI subsidiary before Elon Musk took it over.
And here's Mike Johnson this week laying out his 7 principles of government.
I call them the 7 core principles of American conservatism, but let me concede to you all, I think it's really quintessentially the core principles of our nation. I boil them down to individual freedom, limited government, the rule of law, peace through strength, fiscal responsibility, free markets, and human dignity. Those are the foundations that made us the extraordinary nation that we are. And you and I today are the stewards of those principles. The things that have made us the freest, most powerful, most successful nation in the history of the world. The things that have made us truly exceptional.
Who could disagree with that? Frankly, I think there's a lot to like there, and time will tell if he's able to be true to his word and can keep from getting swamped by, well, the swamp. And let me tell you what, I hope he's all right at it. Now it's time for our U.S. Report regular, former White House Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor of Bondi Partners, Mick Mulvaney. Mick, thank you so much. Chaos is over, for now at least, with Mike Johnson, the new U.S. House Speaker. Mick, tell us who he is. What do we know about him? What can we expect?
A couple different things, James. Thanks as always for having me. He's fairly new. He only got elected in 2016, so he didn't start serving until 2017. He's one of the least experienced speakers of the House in the last 150 years. He's from Louisiana, a relatively small state in the southern part of the country, which now boasts not only the Speaker of the House, but also the Majority Leader. Steve Scalise, who tried and failed to get the Speaker's gavel, is also from that same state. And lastly, and probably most importantly, he's extraordinarily conservative, one of the more conservative members of the House, especially on the social issues. He's written extensively against homosexuality, against abortion, etc. So he is a Marine by training. I believe he's got a legal background as well. He's perceived as being extraordinarily bright, but very down to earth and calm. So you will not see him yelling and screaming from the speaker's dais, but you may see some more conservative proposals put before the House than you would have with perhaps other Republican leadership.
So, Mick, how did he manage to become the first among equals, as it were, in this? I mean, you have a huge moderate wing of the party. You've got a lot of people who would disagree with those stances on social issues and sexuality issues, abortion, homosexuality. He's a very conservative Baptist, is my understanding as well. How did he get so many Republicans across the ticket to sign up to him?
Yeah, it's a great study in human nature. He's a nice guy. He just is. Yes, he disagrees with people even within his own party, but he's a decent fellow that nobody really hates. Keep in mind, that was the key here. With any 4 members of Congress could band together, any 4 members of the Republican conference, I should say, could band together to prevent you or me or anybody else from being the speaker. You had to go find somebody that everybody sort of liked or at least didn't dislike. And that's the shoe that Mike filled. He's a nice guy, again, soft-spoken, even-keeled, very, very conservative, but he hasn't made a lot of enemies, and that is ultimately what I think got him over the hump towards getting the necessary votes.
So Mike Johnson's agenda now, what is his agenda now? Where does the work begin? There's so much to deal with, including keeping the government open. What's the first thing off the rank for him?
Well, they've already done it. As a matter of fact, I think as of yesterday, the first matter of business was to pass a resolution condemning Hamas. By the way, 10 Democrats voted against that resolution, so it's an issue that can divide the Democrat Party. But that was the first order of business. That's done now. They'll begin working now on the request for the $106 billion that the Biden administration has made for funding primarily in Ukraine, but also in Israel. And then they also have to bring up the matter of the funding for the federal government more broadly. The government here runs out of money technically in the middle of November, so they have about 4 weeks to solve that issue. So they're going to have a busy couple of weeks. He's already canceled a week away from Washington, D.C., and has threatened for the first time in a long time to cancel the August vacation if the work doesn't get done by next summer.
So it sounds like he's a real tough talker on this, but what is it going to do about the Republicans with this bill on the funding for both Israel and Ukraine? I know Republican support for Israel is very strong, unlike the Democrats, who, as you said, 10 of them couldn't even bring themselves to vote against Hamas, which seems insane to me, but that's another story. Yet support for Ukraine and Ukraine funding, I think a lot of Republicans see that as a less existential threat, shall we say, to American interests. How is he going to negotiate this one through?
It's going to be a challenge, and here's why. There's $106 billion requested, so let's call it $100 billion. Roughly 60% of that is for Ukraine. Only 12 or 14 is for Israel. So even though the press here are calling it the Israeli, funding supplemental bill, the money for Israel, the lion's share of this money goes to Ukraine. And my guess is, having read some of Mike Johnson's work before he was Speaker, including a letter he wrote when he was trying to become Speaker, the effort will be in the House of Representatives to split these into smaller bills, to get a standalone vote on Ukraine, which may pass anyway, though with fewer Republican votes, and then a standalone vote on Israel, which I expect would pass overwhelmingly. But one of the things that drove some of the Republicans crazy, especially conservatives like myself, was when these massive bills would come in and tie 10 or 15 or 20 issues together. We hated that because you had to vote against stuff that people liked if you wanted to get voted against people that didn't like. So I think one of Mike's first orders of business is to try and change the way the House does business on those monster-sized bills. We'll find out in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I reckon if he got that through, it would be a big shift in the way people are so cynical about politics. But speaking of being cynical about politicians, I got to talk about this crazy story with Democrat New York Representative Jamal Bowman, who a few weeks ago pulled that fire alarm. He's been charged now, and there has been new footage released of him actually apparently pulling that fire alarm or hitting the fire alarm in the Congress building. What's the latest on this? How are the Democrats treating this guy? Are they still embracing him into the fold? You can see him there on the screen there. He's hitting the door. He's going to knock the thing by the side to try and set off the alarm, allegedly because he thought he could just walk out the door. Where does this all wind up landing for Jamal Bowman, Mick Mulvaney?
Yeah, I got to tell you, I do a television program here in the United States a couple times a week, and I was on last night with a Democrat, former party chairman here in Washington, D.C., also a criminal trial lawyer, and he just shook his head and said, look, being an idiot is not a defense. This guy's in a lot of trouble. The rumor here tonight is that he's actually going to plead guilty to that, pay a small fine, take the misdemeanor, and try and move on, but it may come back to haunt him in his next reelection.
Well, being an idiot isn't a great qualifier for re-election, or actually maybe it is in some places. Mick Mulvaney, thank you so much for your time. As always, a lot of fun. Now, I want to turn to the Israel-Hamas war now and the impacts it is having in the U.S. and in places where we might not have already suspected it was doing so. Joining me now to bring us an update on this is investigative immigration reporter for the Daily Caller, Jenny Taylor. Jenny, a great scoop, and thank you for joining us, but a great scoop this week from you. You have revealed that U.S. federal officials are warning that members of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah could be using the chaos at the southern border to cross into the United States. What's happening and how concerning is this?
That's right. This is something that federal border authorities in the United States are warning, that these terrorists could be exploiting the situation at the southern border right now to cross into the U.S. illegally. We know that Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist organizations are not only threats to Israel and the Jewish people, but are also threats to the United States. And of course, that is what's happening. The situation came through in a memo about the war in Israel happening right now, that could metastasize to our southern border. And of course, we know that illegal immigration is up, that it's overwhelming border authorities, and that a lot of people are slipping through the cracks. So it's very concerning.
And there's more to this, too, because you've also found that federal border authorities apprehending Palestinian migrants coming into the U.S. have been classing them as other nationalities. What, so they don't wind up on the books as Palestinians and causing alarm? What is happening here, and is the U.S. potentially facilitating some of this?
The situation is that we just don't know how many Palestinians are coming across because you have a system in place right now, because the U.S. doesn't, of course, recognize Palestine as a country when the country of origin is being reported, even if a migrant has the Palestinian Authority issued passport. If they do have documents, they are normally categorized as Israeli in a lot of cases, just because that's the nearest only option. And there's no actual blanket policy about this. And so it forces these agents to make kind of arbitrary decisions about how they should classify these people. Of course, with this current memo, maybe that will change, but it is something that is alarming due to the fact that we have this situation in Israel, and then it could be coming across our southern border.
And Jenny, to be quite clear, too, we know about this because these are the migrants that have come through that have had contact with border officials, the ones who they've picked up. But there could also be, quite easily, for every one that we know about, another one who we don't, who is already in the country.
Right, exactly. We are just seeing this massive surge in illegal immigration, surge in fentanyl, a surge in migrants from outside of Mexico and Central America. This is something that is definitely a national security risk. We saw the number of terrorism apprehensions, migrants whose names appear on the terror watch list that have crossed illegally, surged in numbers we just haven't seen ever before in our history. It's something that is just out of hand, out of control. And within the United States, authorities also have their hands tied when it comes to law enforcement authorities to be able to go after people who are committing crimes that are here illegally or that should be deported based on visa overstays. It's just not a priority under the Biden administration.
Well, it sounds like it's an absolute tragedy waiting to happen, but I want to ask about the efforts to stop all of this. Texas's Attorney General has filed a lawsuit seeking to block federal agents from cutting and destroying the razor wire that the state has installed. Will they be successful? And, I mean, how can Homeland Security be against anything put up to stop people from coming across illegally?
Right. It's as you're showing this clip here, I actually took this video, and it was right when a Border Patrol agent had fist bumped a migrant after that agent had cut the razor wire that Texas Governor Greg Abbott had erected in at the border there, right on the front line, to stop people from coming. Now, there's this issue of federal law versus state law, and of course, the Biden administration itself being at odds with a Republican governor in Texas. But it is something that has now come to the courts to decide, possibly. And we even know now that Abbott has put up even more razor wire in that area. And on top of that, he's put a razor wire, barrier between states, between Texas and New Mexico, because a lot of these migrants will cross illegally into New Mexico and then walk over to Texas, or they're transported to Texas. And of course, that has issues within the state. Migrants who are smuggled, for example, create issues, security issues on the country roads there. Sometimes you have one-lane roads where there's car chases and extreme, mishaps, and people are killed because of car wrecks.
Unbelievable. Jenny Taylor, thank you so much for the great work you're doing with the Daily Caller and bringing it to us here on the U.S. Report. Really appreciate it. Now, after the break, Noah Tishby on the rising swamp of left-wing anti-Semitism. But first, more embarrassing details have emerged from Joe Biden fluffing his lines while hosting Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. He tried to recite the Australian Army's Ode to Remembrance, a moving tribute to the fallen. At least it usually is, except when you also recite the punctuation.
And that old remembrance promise, at the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them, period.
Period. At least he didn't say turn page. What a mess. Noah Tishby after the break. Welcome back to the program. And amid the Israel-Hamas war, we have seen a sickening surge in anti-Semitism across the U.S. and even right here in Australia. Joining me to discuss what's going on in America is Israeli activist and actress Noah Tishby. Noah, we've talked about this many times before, and we've seen far too many reports of campus anti-Semitism. but I wanted to share with you this clip of something that happened at Cooper Union in New York the other day when Jewish students had to barricade themselves into a library as pro-Palestinian protesters tried to bust in. Have a look at this. Now, some breaking news here, Noah, that a professor, Shelley-Ann Rodriguez, was seen here in an earlier story holding a machete to the throat of a New York Post journalist and was fired from her previous academic job for that. Well, she was rehired by Cooper Union, where that library incident took place, and was seen at an anti-Israel Day of Action march outside the offices of a Democratic congressman who has been standing up for Israel. Now, I've got to get your reaction, Noah. What is happening here? How bad has the American University campus become on the issue of Israel and anti-Semitism?
They are not just, they didn't become horrific. They have been horrible for a very long time. This is not a rise in anti-Semitism. What's happening right now is that the anti-Semitism that was there all along, that we have tried to warn against, is coming out to the surface. To some extent, this is not a bad thing that's happening right now because they're coming out of their holes, and we're going to take names, we're going to see who they are, and hopefully there are going to be repercussions. I got a video today from UCLA in which students at UCLA are calling for Jewish genocide. In those words exactly, Jewish genocide. So we're living in a world right now in which the greatest massacre that occurred and happened to the Jewish people in one day since the Holocaust happened on October 7th, and people are calling for more massacre of Jews all over the world. If that doesn't make people stop, I don't know what will. And here's another thing that I want your audience to remember and to really be present to. The attacks of Hamas on Israel have not stopped since October 7th. So it is not as if we had one terrorist attack, which again, I want to remind you, the terrorist attack on September 11th, it was 19 terrorists. Here we're talking about a size of a battalion. We're talking about nearly 3,000. So it's a military that attacked Israel on that day. But it hadn't stopped since. So there were 8 terrorists that tried to penetrate Israel last night from the water. There are still reports on terrorists that are coming up from the north. Hamas is still launching rockets at Israel. So it's very curious that Hamas is running out of everything except rockets in Gaza. And these attacks are continuing right now, being backed by left-wing demonstrations on college campuses, which I can only describe the same way as the White House is, which is grotesque.
Yeah, and Noah, thank you very much for that important reminder about the fact that this is an ongoing thing, not a one-off. But, you know, the universities aren't the only institution corrupted here. We had a New York Times reporter who came under fire last year for praising Adolf Hitler in multiple Facebook posts. Well, apparently she was rehired by the New York Times to cover the war, the conflict between Israel and Hamas and, well, could be Hezbollah and could be Iran soon. And the New York Times seemed to shrug this off. What is happening in some of these journalistic institutions as well?
I'm not entirely sure. The AP just decided that they're not designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. And the BBC, in which I was interviewed for last week, and showed them a tweet that was still up there, claiming that Israel killed 500 citizens in an attack on a hospital, which obviously turned out to be not true, is still up there. So there are a lot of news outlets that are taking the word of a terrorist organization. And it's quite curious that people will never take the word. Any reputable news organization will not take the word of ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. But when it comes to anti-Israel organizations, then they will just take Hamas words at face value. And this is causing bloodshed, and it's causing attacks on universities all over the world. So this this misrepresentation of the war is causing bloodshed all over the world.
And Noah, I want to ask you about Karine Jean-Pierre and her comments in a moment. But before I do, I want to ask you just quickly, what do you make of all of these news organizations out there that just simply take the word of the very bizarrely named Hamas Ministry of Health, or whatever they're calling themselves, about death toll, which is clearly propaganda and designed to create a moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas? What is your message to news outlets that may be doing this sort of unthinkingly without fully understanding the implications of what happens when they report like this.
I hope they do understand the implications by now, because the evidence is clear that this is causing bloodshed, this is causing riots, this is causing anti-Israel and anti-Semitism rise all over the world. So I hope they do. But look, we've been warning against the anti-Israel bias for a very long time. It seems like no matter what, Israel can do no right. That's just the way it is. And I don't know what else to attribute this to other than subconscious anti-Semitism, because when it comes to the Jewish self-sovereignty and self-governance, people feel uncomfortable with it, and they would expect anything of Israel. And look, Israel's not a perfect country because it's a country, and no country is perfect. But Israel's the only country that's afforded that. Nobody would ever take the word of a terrorist organization over a democracy in a million years. Nobody would do that. But when it comes to Israel, people allow themselves to do that.
And finally, Noah, I just want to play this little bit from Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House spokeswoman. She was asked about anti-Semitic attacks, and I played a bit of this before, but I want to play this for you and have you get your reaction. Have a listen to this.
We have not seen any credible threats. I know there's been always questions about credible threats, and so just want to make sure that that's out there. But look, Muslim and those perceived to be Muslim have endured a disproportionate number of hate-fueled attacks.
Now, she later claimed that she didn't understand the question, but how does the White House spokeswoman turn a question about anti-Semitism into something about Islamophobia?
I'm not entirely sure, especially when the American president is a self-described Zionist and has been acting pretty profoundly and beautifully and powerfully about this particular war. Here's the thing. We have all learned about subconscious biases, and we all learned that we need to do our work. And when there's any kind of discrimination happening towards any other ethnicity or minority, people take heed and they stop and they listen. But when it comes to the Jewish community, we equate this to all lives matter. So when Black Lives Matter started, all of us stood by the Black community and were like, yes, Black Lives Matter. And we didn't say all lives matter around that movement. But this is what's happening right now. We are talking about anti-Semitism, marginalization of the Jewish community, discrimination, online and offline, and attacks. How can she say there are no credible threats? I can send her videos of attacks that are happening today at UCLA, at Cooper Union, at Tulane University. There are attacks every single day. So to say that she is not getting credible attacks is preposterous.
Noah, thank you so much for your time here. Noah Tishby on the U.S. Report. Look forward to speaking again, hopefully on happier circumstances. Now, still more to come in the U.S. Report. But first, you know the old saying, a broken clock is right once a day? Well, the same thing can go for White House flacks. You know John Kirby, the guy who looks like a dead ringer for Michael Scott from The Office? Well, credit where credit is due. He actually had a moment of clarity on Friday, unlike his co-spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre, and he stood up to a reporter who kept repeating Hamas lines about death counts. And yes, he stood up for Israel. Have a look at this.
Besides saying that he doesn't have confidence in these numbers, the president went further to say that innocents will die and that this is the price of the war. You also said that.
I have indeed.
Yeah, don't you think this is insensitive? There being very harsh criticism about it. For example, the Council of American Islamic Relations said it was deeply disturbed and called on the president to apologize. Would the president apologize, and does he regret say something like that? About
What's harsh is the way Hamas is using people as human shields. What's harsh is taking a couple of hundred hostages and leaving families anxious, waiting and worrying to figure out where their loved ones are.
Powerful stuff from John Kirby. I don't know if he keeps his White House car park after that, but even if that wasn't hilarious, it was heartening, and that's why I wanted to bring it to you. Only in America is next. And now it's time for a little segment we like to call Only in America. Right, well, guess what? We've made it almost all the way through the show, and it looks like I forgot to wish someone a very happy birthday. This lady, this future president-to-be or something, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who on her birthday, October 27, 2016, tweeted the fateful words, "Happy birthday" to this future president. As cringeworthy bits of social media go, it's right up there. And in terms of bad calls, it's a bit like that famous Dewey defeats Truman headline from 1948. Of course, a few days later, Hillary would be defeated by one Donald J. Trump, dashing her dreams of the presidency. Anyway, let's all get together now and sing Hillary a very special happy birthday. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3.
President Obama, for the
what a great honor to be able to introduce for the first time ever anywhere the...
I tell you what, I could watch that all night, and after this, I probably will. That's all the time we have for the show this week, but until next time, bye-bye.